Evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Friday, the 4th of October. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined this evening by William Duguid, the writer, activist with Perth Kinross Yes Hub. Good evening, William.
Good evening, Brian. Good to be back with you here.
Well, you say that, but it's Friday night. I'm sure you'd rather be somewhere else. But thank you for joining us. Here's our Ukraine update. Today would be the 954th day of the war in Ukraine. NATO's chief Mark Rutte has told Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that his goal as head of the military alliance is to ensure that Ukraine prevails. In a major show of support for Kyiv, Rutte went to the Ukrainian capital for his maiden trip as Secretary General of the alliance. Rutte said he chose Kiev as his first trip to make crystal clear to you, the people of Ukraine, and to everyone watching that NATO stands with Ukraine. In a joint media appearance with Rutte, Zelensky blasted Western delays over supplying long-range weapons. We need sufficient quantity and quality of weapons, including long-range weapons, that, in my opinion, our partners are already dragging out, Zelensky said. Asked to respond on Zelensky's comments, Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary Sabrina Singh said, "We have a limited supply of long-range missiles and we're not dragging it out." Ukraine has opened its first recruitment office in Poland, aiming to enlist citizens for its fight against Russia's invasion. The move comes as Kyiv is scrambling to bolster its ranks to stave off Moscow's invasion. Ukraine announced its plans to recruit a Ukrainian legion in July, hoping to convince thousands of men who have fled the country to avoid the war to enlist. The government estimates that about 300,000 people of combat age are living in Poland. Thousands of people in Berlin demonstrated against Germany's military support for Ukraine during a rally organised by a radical left-wing collective. Participants gathered in the German capital and brandished placards reading "Negotiations, no weapons, no to war," and "Pacifism is not naive." Some also held anti-American signs. One of their main demands was for Germany to stop sending weapons to Ukraine. Far-left populist leader Sarah Wagenknecht, who attended the Berlin protest, has long called for an end to weapon deliveries to Kyiv and opposes a plan to deploy US long-range missiles in Germany. Ukraine has said a Russian drone attack killed 3 people, including a young child, in its northern Chernihiv region. Russian drones hit a gas truck that was making deliveries to households in a border village. 3 people were killed in the blast, including a child born in 2018, the police said. 4 others were hospitalised, including 2 children, aged 4 and 13. Russia's defence ministry confirmed reports that its forces had taken control of the eastern Ukrainian town of Vuhledar, crediting what it called decisive action taken by units in its east military grouping. The town, which Russia calls Ilgadar, had resisted Russian assaults for more than 2 years. Croatia will host a Balkans Leaders Summit on Ukraine next week that will also be attended by President Zelensky, Croatia's Prime Minister Andrej Plenković said on Thursday. The aim of the meeting, to be held in the southern Adriatic resort of Dubrovnik, is that the whole region supports Ukraine and the Ukrainian people in the fight for freedom. William, is there anything in tonight's update that you wanted to make mention of?
Well, just that the Ukraine conflict is very much secondary in most people's view now to the much more dangerous looking conflagration that's beginning in the Middle East. And we're seeing, I think, some of the results of that in that I don't know, compared to 4 weeks ago or the last couple of times I've been on, when Ukraine was actually making moves into Russia a little bit and actually giving them something to think about, I believe the balance looks like it's tilting now the other way, and hence the impatience of Zelensky to get his long range missiles, which I think would be a real wild card in this situation anyway, and also possibly the reluctance of some in the West and even under the NATO umbrella to provide those weapons. And I think also popular sentiment in many places as you can see in Germany, is beginning to cool. And I think everybody is getting impatient with this war that doesn't actually seem to be reaching any definitive stage. And it would be interesting to see what we could do about maybe getting some sort of settlement that brings it to an end, that is in some way satisfactory to both parties. And I don't know how far away that is. I don't see any move amongst major politicians for it, but I'm pretty sure that the world can't really be doing with two major conflicts in two areas in the world simultaneously. I think it doesn't work in terms of the sustainability of the planet, and it certainly doesn't work in terms of the sustainability of our economies or our general mental well-being. And I think that's what I'm beginning to see coming through here as we get closer and closer to 1,000 days and even 3 years of this conflict. So not a satisfactory situation at all. I think Ukraine will get its weapons, but I think the balance may be beginning to shift, and that's an interesting move.
Yeah, thank you, William. It certainly has been quite sobering to sit here in the studio day after day and watch, read out that number, that daily number going up and up and up. So moving on to the latest from Israel and Gaza, at least 41,802 Palestinian people have been killed and 96,844 injured in Gaza since the 7th of October, the Gaza Health Ministry said in a statement. A source close to Hezbollah told the AFP news agency that Israel had conducted 11 consecutive strikes on the militant group's stronghold in Beirut on Thursday night. Hashem Safedin, the most likely person to replace Hassan Nasrallah as leader of Hezbollah and the head of its executive council, was the target of the strikes, the New York Times and Axios reported, citing Israeli officials. An Israeli strike on Friday morning near Lebanon's Masna border crossing with Syria cut off a road used by hundreds of thousands of people to flee Israeli bombardments in recent days, Lebanon's Transport Minister Ali Hamiyeh told Reuters. The strike was said to have created a 4-metre or 12-foot wide crater. Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei said Iran's recent missile attack on Israel was legal and legitimate and was the minimum punishment for Israel's crimes. In a rare speech, he also said the Hamas-led 7th of October attack on southern Israel was a legitimate act. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi visited Beirut to meet Lebanon's caretaker Prime Minister Najib Mikati and Speaker of Parliament Nabi Berri, a close ally of Hezbollah. The Israeli military this morning told the residents of over 20 more southern towns in Lebanon to evacuate immediately. At least 18 people have been killed in the occupied West Bank in an airstrike on a refugee camp in Tulkarm. Among the dead was a family of 4, including 2 children, according to reports. William, again, was there anything there that you wanted to highlight?
No, it's just that we're teetering on the brink of major escalation if we're not already there, and this one could be the trigger to what becomes World War III, particularly if the major powers are drawn into it, and this is the problem. It's a nearly impossible issue to solve because it's not any longer just tit for tat. It's something that goes back 75 years, where the solution is needed, and both sides will not necessarily be comfortable with that solution. But we absolutely, as a species, as a planet, must find a solution to this, because this really could get way out of control. We're already seeing, obviously, the loss of life is going to be dreadful and has been dreadful for the last year. We're going to begin to see shocks on the world economy. The price of oil is already up by 5% and under considerable threat with all that's going on. And in the meantime, the Western leaders once again appear to be foursquare behind Israel and everything it does, while ignoring the things that it does that don't fit the pattern of Israel as victim. It's a complicated situation. I get that. But I really think that for quite a long time now, the populations of the world have been ahead of the leaders of the world in their desire for peace and their realization that this is not in any sense a black and white situation. I really find the Middle East situation incredibly frustrating at the moment, and I'm very worried about what comes in the next few days.
Thank you, William. Rachel Reeves is paving the way for a multi-billion-pound increase in the public sector investment at the budget after the government announced plans to commit. I'm going to reread that sentence if you don't mind. Rachel Reeves is paving the way for a multi-billion-pound increase in public sector investment at the budget after the government announced plans to commit almost £22 billion over 25 years to fund carbon capture and storage projects. Forgive me, I'm falling over my words tonight. The government hopes the investment will reignite the UK's struggling heavy industry by funding two major carbon capture and storage clusters, one in Teesside in North East England and the second in North West England. Following the announcement, First Minister John Swinney has written to the Prime Minister seeking clarity on the timelines, funding and criteria for the carbon capture, utilisation and storage Track 2 clusters, which include the Acorn project in Scotland. The SNP's Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn, branded Labour clueless as it emerged the Scottish Acorn carbon project was once again snubbed for funding in favour of English sites. In 2021, the Acorn project, situated at St Fergus near Peterhead, was snubbed in the Track 1 stage of funding for carbon capture sites and was instead given reserve status. This followed a previous funding snub in 2015 when the Tories withdrew £1 billion from Peterhead despite promising the investment ahead of the 2014 independence referendum. In July 2023, then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak visited the site and pledged support to the project, but little has moved forward since then. William, I don't know if you like me, I'm kind of in two minds about this news item. Part of me wants to concentrate on the fact that we've been told by experts that we need this Acorn project if Scotland is to meet its net zero commitments, and yet at the same time it just seems that this is another example of the current Labour administration following the previous Tory administrations when it comes to not doing something different or not changing what's been done before. I mean, which is the more important, do you think?
Well, it's undoubtedly the case that Scotland is getting snubbed once again here. I'm pretty sure about that. Um, I am very much in two minds, though, about the efficacy of carbon capture. It is a controversial technology, and it could be read as a green light to fossil fuel producers to keep going, in this in sense that this technology will make it all right. And I'm not convinced that the technology will make it all right, and I'm not sure all the experts are convinced that it will either. Um, there's ever the possibility of leakage, for example. The blue hydrogen that carbon capture and storage is likely to be able to produce is not as clean as the green hydrogen that could be produced from water and renewable electricity via an electrolyzer. And yeah, I'm not sure that this is the right way to go. And I appreciate that for Scotland, it's been dangled in front of us really since 2007 as a thing that was going to happen that would move things on in and around the North Sea. But I am not convinced that it's a good thing, and therefore I'm not quite sure that the Labour government is not just wasting some of its capital spending. It may technically get you within net zero, according to what the figures say, but in terms of actually looking after the planet, not so sure. But that won't stop them snubbing Scotland, which is a political issue, and yes, another thing that we should constantly be taking note of, because we should be deciding these things for ourselves.
Thank you, William. Yeah, and as you say, this isn't really the first time. In 2007, there was we were told that proposals couldn't be revisited for a green energy plant at Peterhead. And in 2011, there were plans for the UK's first carbon capture project at Longannet Power Station in Fife were scrapped. So, yeah, is this a trend that we're seeing? And is it going to continue with a Labour government?
Well, I dare say it will. I'm not quite sure what the Labour government is right now doing in terms of its overall strategy. What they seem to be saying is we're really short of money and there's a black hole, but it looks as if in the coming budget they're going to change the fiscal rules to allow more capital spending. And that, of course, could be capital spending as this is in England and North Wales. It could turn into capital spending in Scotland if that's electorally advantageous to them. What I am pretty sure of is that um, it's pretty much par for the course for a Labour government in the sense that they would like to have their willing MSPs in Holyrood. They'd like to have a majority there, and they'd like to have their majority in England, deciding everything that happens for Scotland, mainly, I think, to the advantage of their large voter bloc in the north of England. That is very much par for the course, that kind of behaviour, and I don't see that ending. I don't think they're quite as duplicitous as the Tory administration of the last 14 years, but there's a long way to go and a lot of suits to be provided for Keir Starmer before we can make a definitive judgment on that. But Scotland, I think, now that the MPs in Scotland have been secured as stage one of their ideas, Scotland will now be at the bottom of the list for most things. Maybe a nameplate that says GB Energy, that might well be about it, and a few jobs maybe, but not the lion's share by any means. And again, things being done to us rather than by us.
Yes, and I read somewhere that when before the general election, Starmer was saying that Scotland was key, but then in his conference speech, Scotland was only mentioned once or twice. But so yeah, might be
A
indicative.
hidden key then.
Yes. So the next item is Boris Johnson has called for a referendum on the UK's membership of the European Convention on Human Rights, a move likely to increase pressure on those vying for the Conservative leadership to follow suit. The former Prime Minister told the Daily Telegraph there was a strong case for a vote on the ECHR, which some Tories blame for hampering their efforts to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda. Johnson, who is promoting his memoir, remains popular with many Conservative members who will soon vote for the next party leader. Robert Jenrick, a frontrunner, is the only candidate to promise to take the UK out of the ECHR. Asked if he would support a referendum on the ECHR, Johnson told the newspaper, I would. I think it has changed. It has become much more legally adventurous. It's trying to second guess what national jurisdictions should do. He added, there's a strong case for a proper referendum, a proper discussion about it, because I'm not certain that it actually provides people with protections that they wouldn't otherwise have. The UK's membership of the convention has become one of the most hotly contested issues in the Tory leadership battle. Some Conservatives have blamed the court in Strasbourg, which interprets the convention, for the previous government's failure to implement the Rwanda deportation scheme, even though it was blocked by the UK Supreme Court. So, William, do we care that this is likely to put pressure on the Tory leadership hopefuls in Westminster?
Well, it'll be interesting because that will shape the view of the Tory party. And at the moment, there's no great guarantee that Labour's 172 seat majority, or whatever the figure now is, after people have been having the whip withdrawn and Rosie Duffield. So I think we're probably down closer to 165 or 164 even now. How long that will sustain them? Because for a party that won such a thumping electoral majority, whatever the votes actually may have said in terms of percentages, they're in quite a bit of chaos. And therefore, it looks as if, at this stage, they could be a one-term government and maybe a shorter term than we might imagine. And that means that what the Tories are saying at their conference and who leads them next and how they're driven into their positions does matter, because it will have an increasing influence on what's actually likely to happen to us. So, yeah, I think the general gravitational pull in the Tory party is going to be to take us out of the ECHR. It's amazing that a charlatan like Boris Johnson still has the influence he does, but he has remained popular, and in a party that can even begin to rehabilitate Liz Truss, Johnson is definitely going to come back as a potential saviour, you would think. And I think it's just a dreadful development to take us out of the ECHR. Winston Churchill, much admired in some British circles, was instrumental in the foundation of the ECHR, and several notable figures in creating it were British, and it was very much in line with our way of looking at the, if you like, the modern world then. And we seem to be going against it for all the wrong reasons. It's just so that we can start actually inflicting harm on people, because that is what we think is the best way of preserving things that may not even be worth preserving. I think it would be a really, really retrograde development if we were to come out of the ECHR. There's no immediate possibility of it, but don't discount the Tories in 2029 coming along and doing something about it.
Thanks, William. Technically, we're out of time on this topic, but do you think is he really just trying to hijack the news to promote his memoirs? And how much do you think would this question feature, or this topic feature, in the Laura Kuenssberg interview that was scrapped?
Well, you'll have to ask Laura to BCC her interview notes to you as well as to Boris Johnson to find that out. He's got Tom Bradby tonight on ITV, apparently. There's an interview going on there. He doesn't need to hijack the news. The news welcomes being hijacked. It invites him into the cabin and says, point some weapon at us and tell us what to do. That's the magic of Boris Johnson, and it's pernicious, but it's there.
Okay, thanks, William. Scottish Labour are reeling from a slump in the polls and by-election defeats. Press reports say that Scottish Labour Party MSPs are frustrated with Scottish Labour MPs for failing to speak out against Sir Keir Starmer's cuts to the winter fuel payment, which will hit an estimated 880,000 Scottish pensioners. A party source is reported to have said they need to know their lane and stay in their lane after Labour MPs tried to shift the blame back onto their MSP counterparts. It comes after Labour lost 2 council by-elections to the SNP in Dundee yesterday, and follows a series of opinion polls showing support for Labour has plummeted. A YouGov poll published yesterday found the Labour government now has a minus 52 approval rating in Scotland. That's down by 46 points since July, with 61% of Scots disapproving of the Labour government's record and just 9% approving. Separately, an opinion poll for The Observer, published on the 29th of September, found Sir Keir Starmer's approval ratings have fallen to their lowest ever levels at minus 26. That's down 45 points since July. The poll also found a majority of voters, that's 57%, think the Labour government is worse or about the same as the last Tory government, and a plurality of voters, that's 45%, think it is out of touch with ordinary people. Polling by Survation for The Times, published in September, found a majority of Scots, that's 56%, do not think the Labour government is acting in the best interests of Scotland, while just 15% do. A majority of 51% opposed Labour's cuts to winter fuel payments, and almost half of Labour voters in Scotland, that's 44%, think Keir Starmer's government has failed to meet expectations. So, William, I'm kind of split on this one, but do you think this Labour government's going to learn from its rocky start?
I think it might have to take some things into consideration. I do think the first budget is going to be very interesting. Are they going to start finding money for things that previously they didn't think they were going to be able to? Changing the fiscal rules, for example, to allow more capital spending is definitely going to be a thing as far as I can see. They were really hit very badly by the outcry over the winter fuel payments. There's no doubt about that. If you had been chapping on the doors in any of the council by-elections that have just taken place in Scotland, you would be getting very, very strong feelings against the removal of the winter fuel payment, probably even from people that weren't going to be getting it removed, because the general unfairness of subjecting people to a cliff edge, even if you think means testing is a good idea, to do it with a cliff edge is a nonsense. And bear in mind that Labour themselves in 2017 calculated that just this sort of move would cause 4,000 deaths. Either they've changed their mind on that, and I'd like to know why they have, if they have, or they no longer particularly care about that. And that is a worrying thing. Even at the Hub Coffee Morning last week, winter fuel payments were top of the agenda with the folks who came in of pensionable age who were enjoying their coffee, and that was what they chose to talk about. We weren't forcing politics on them, folks. So you can see why the change that Labour has introduced in Scotland has been one that has not actually benefited them. And I think they're going to have to look very carefully, not just in Scotland, about how they portray themselves, what policy stances they take, and what they do about the feeling that maybe they're not much better in terms of corruption than their predecessors. And for them to be thought of in the same boat as their predecessors is quite an achievement already. And that's been done in a very short time. This is a precipitous fall in their approval ratings. And they're going to need to do something about that, I think.
And what about Scottish Labour? We're told that Anna Sarwar's success or failure in 2026 in Holyrood is going to depend on how Starmer performs. Do you think if there's any phone calls between if Sarwar's phoning Starmer to offer him advice, is Starmer going to take any of it?
He hasn't shown any signs of particularly listening to Anna Sarwar so far. Um, Sarwar has been forced into um, a succession of, it's not U-turns because he's never been confronted with the information, but pledges that Labour candidates in Scotland were making before the election have manifestly not been fulfilled. In fact, the opposite has happened. And yes, that must be embarrassing and troubling for Anas Sarwar. And absolutely, if this doesn't get better for them, they are in trouble in the 2026 election. An SNP that is still really struggling to get any sort of traction in the popular mind is still going to be in with a chance of beating them. And they must be incredibly frustrated. Sarwar may have Starmer on speed dial, but it may be speed dial to his answer phone.
Okay, thank you for that. And continuing on that theme, the SNP is celebrating a double by-election victory in Lochee and Strathmartin wards, increasing the size of their council group in Dundee. The two newly elected councillors, Lee Mills and Jimmy Black, defeated opposition candidates in a surprise upset last night, with senior Labour Party sources already laying blame at the door of number 10. Commenting, SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown said, "This is a fantastic double win for the SNP and a real vote of confidence from the people of Lochee and Strathmartin. Our incredible candidates, Lee Mills and Jimmy Black, alongside our amazing activists, took the SNP's positive message to voters on doorsteps across Dundee and repeatedly heard about betrayal felt following the first few weeks of the Labour government." Continued, whether it's millions of pounds of levelling up investment or life-saving support for Scottish pensioners, the Labour Party has shown that nothing is off the table when it comes to their austerity plans. He went on to say their own MPs voted for these policies, as well as the two-child cap. These are Labour Party choices that will harm the most vulnerable Scots, and tonight we saw the consequences of those decisions. They only have themselves to blame. William, I do have a question for you. What do you think? What do you think the SNP has? Has the public now seen that Labour lied to them in the run up to the general election? Do you think is that the reason why they've voted SNP and really Labour have done this to themselves?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I think people have seen through Labour, and the Labour vote is in the process of collapsing right now. The SNP vote is not holding up all that well, either in these two by-elections or in the one in Perth North, which they won last week. First preference-wise, they were way down in Perth. They're about 6% down, 6 percentage points down in Lochee, and a wee bit more than that. I think it's about 10 percentage points down. This is the SNP we're talking about in Strathmartin. But the other thing to mention is that the turnout in both of these by-elections, and indeed in the Perth one, is absolutely appalling. We're talking about 21.4% turnout in Lochee and a 22.3% turnout in Strathmartin. So that level of turnout does speak about voters staying at home, particularly Labour voters, maybe some SNP voters as well, and maybe some of the people in that area are wondering what the hell can we vote for that's going to deliver. But it's also too small to make any definitive judgments about what these by-elections mean. Although in the short term, it's absolutely fair to say that what they do mean is that the SNP is now in a far more comfortable position in Perth and Kinross, and also now following last night in Dundee, where they have now a fairly comfortable majority that it's not just one or two, it's now about three or four, and that does make a difference. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next 3 years. Labour, meanwhile, will be rather hoping that the next by-election is rather a long way away. I suspect there may be more council by-elections round the corner, though, so that'll get quite interesting.
Okay, so watch this space.
Mm-hmm.
The European Court of Justice, the ECJ, has ruled that gender and nationality alone are sufficient grounds for a country to grant asylum to women from Afghanistan, where the ruling Taliban have sharply curtailed women's rights. Authorities in Austria refused refugee status to two Afghan women after they applied for asylum in 2015 and 2020. Women challenged the refusal before the Austrian Supreme Administrative Court, which in turn requested a ruling from the ECJ, the top European Union court. It is unnecessary to establish that there is a risk that the applicant will actually and specifically be subject to acts of persecution if she returns to her country of origin, the ECJ said in its ruling. It is sufficient to take into account her nationality and gender alone. Since the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan in 2021, they've clamped down on women's rights, including limits to schooling, work, and general independence in daily life. In August, the Taliban codified a long set of rules governing morality in line with Sharia law. The rules are enforced by the Morality Ministry, which says it has detained thousands of people for violations. The United Nations Human Rights Chief has called for the Taliban to repeal a set of egregious laws that he said were attempting to turn women into shadows. One woman, called AH in court papers, fled Afghanistan for Iran with her mother and sisters when she was about 13, after her father, who was a drug addict, tried to sell her to finance his addiction, according to a court document. The other woman, identified as FN, was born in 2007, has never lived in Afghanistan. She and her family had been living in neighbouring Iran without residence permits, meaning they had no right to work, and she could not receive an education. She fled Iran and filed an asylum request in Austria. She, FN, said that if she returned to Afghanistan, as a woman she would be at risk of abduction, would be unable to attend school, and might be unable to support herself without her family there, an ECJ document said. William, the sentence that struck me in that item was that these laws are attempting to turn women into shadows. But this is going to make it sound, I don't mean to trivialise this, but does this show that maybe the Austrian government, and maybe they're not alone in European governments, or certainly the previous Conservative government we had in the UK, do you think they've got some kind of tendencies, some kind of Taliban tendencies, or have got something in common with the Taliban?
I don't know about that, but I think there's so many trouble spots in the world generally that governments are resisting granting asylum a wee bit more than might otherwise have been the case. There's just going people needing to claim it, and so the Austrians would have been relying on the need to prove things that had been done to the two people who were involved in the court cases. And what the European Court of Justice here has simply said is that no, you can pretty well assume that if you're a female from Afghanistan, the Taliban is not doing you any good at all, and you're perfectly justified in seeking asylum. And it's interesting to see what the Austrians do about that. But I don't think that they're demonstrating any Taliban tendencies. They're just trying to cut down the number of asylum seeking cases that they have to approve.
Thank you, William. Um, so, EU leaders have given the green light to extra tariffs on electric vehicles from China, despite opposition from 5 countries, including Germany, where car manufacturers condemned the decision as a potential fatal blow for the auto industry. The European Commission, which previously approved the step in June after an inquiry found that Beijing's state aid to auto manufacturers was unfair, now has to rein in to impose steep tariffs for 5 years from the end of this month. The tariffs of up to 35.3%, coming on top of existing duties of 10%, were supported by 10 member states, including France, Italy and Poland, several European diplomats told the AFP news agency. Although the tariffs did not win support from a majority of states, the opposition was not enough to block them, which would have required the objection of at least 15 nations, representing 65% of the bloc's population. Brussels says the measures aim to protect European car makers in a critical industry that provides jobs to about 14 million people across the EU, but does not benefit from hefty state subsidies like China. So, William, I'm wondering, keeping in mind China's poor record on human rights, but which side do you think the current Labour government would come down on if Brexit hadn't happened, and if we still had a say in the EU? Would they follow previous Tory administrations and stand on and want a trade deal with China?
I suspect they would. China is going to be a feature in the world economy in a much bigger way in the years to come, even than it has been in the years just past. China is going to be the major world economic power, and there is going to be a huge temptation to do trade deals with them. That's simply a fact. The problem is, of course, that China is subsidizing its car makers in this case, and allowing them, therefore, to steal a march on the established car makers in Europe. And it's interesting just to see just how split the European vote is. 5 entirely against and 12 abstentions, and only 10 in support of the tariffs. The tariffs do equalize things, but there is the threat that there might not be the inward Chinese investment that these countries are looking for. Now, I suspect that Labour government in the UK, and probably the Tories as well, if they had been in power, would be very much in favour of inward Chinese investment. Hinkley Point was one area where it would have happened and is still happening. And there would be others as well. So they would possibly be a wee bit concerned about applying these tariffs, just as so many other European countries are. And it's a dilemma, but it's a dilemma that isn't going away because China's economic power is a gravitational force and it will get greater. And the world will have to adjust to it somehow. Um, don't know how. We shall find out.
Thank you, William. Catastrophic floods have caused 18 deaths and enormous damage to parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina following torrential rain last night. Other people have been reported missing as torrential rain and landslides destroyed homes, roads and bridges across the centre of the country. Reports from the country say that the situation is the worst in Jablanica and Fonica. So far, 16 people have died in Jablanica and 2 in Fonica. The conditions are also bad in Kiseljak, Kisevo and Konjak. Again, apologies for my poor pronunciation. Bosnia's presidency said it had requested military help for the wider Jablanica area, and engineers, rescue units and a helicopter were deployed, including to rescue 17 people from a mental health hospital. Neighbouring Croatia was also hit by floods today, though there were no reports of casualties. Authorities issued a severe weather warning for the Adriatic coast and central regions of the country. William, other places in the world, not to detract from the terrible situation in Bosnia, but Florida, North Carolina, Nigeria, Tunisia, Mexico, India, Nepal, Vietnam, Poland, and Austria are all among places that have experienced flooding in the last month. Central Europe has been deluged over the past 2 weeks. So, do you think it's a sobering thought? But do you think the loss of life to floods like this will, at some point, no longer come as much of a surprise?
It won't come as a surprise, but all of this is something that we need to take into account in what we're doing. It's now, I think, almost beyond dispute that we are experiencing much more chaotic weather in several parts of the world than we have done, with truly amazing amounts of rain falling in a very short time. And we're past the stage, I would suggest, where we can do much to stop that happening in terms of what we do about climate change, whether it's man-made or whether we decide it's something else. We can take measures to try and make things better in future, but something that's going to become increasingly important is going to be adjusting to the situation we have now. Because the one thing that all of these things tell us, particularly Florida and North Carolina being blown away by Hurricane Helene, and now the floods here, is that the infrastructure that we have is very, very vulnerable to these extreme weather events. And that will inevitably lead to loss of life. It will lead to complete disruption of our way of life. And we need to be thinking about what it's going to take just to make us a wee bit more resilient in the face of these things. And that's going to mean spending money, and a lot of governments aren't going to like it. But the alternative is probably quite difficult to contemplate as well. So that's going to be a growing dilemma, and I think we'll see many more instances in the coming months of how that is beginning to play out.
Thank you, William. Claire Adamson, MSP, has urged young people to go for a career in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, otherwise known as STEM, as she spoke of her honour at receiving the 2024 SSERC Honorary Fellowship Award. SSERC is a not-for-profit company and registered charity which provides support for STEM education across all 32 Scottish educational authorities. The SSERC Honorary Fellowship is a prestigious award given to individuals who have made an exceptional contribution to STEM learning and training in Scotland throughout their careers and demonstrate the values associated with the organisation. SSERC offers a wide range of STEM engagement and enrichment programmes to further increase access to and participation in STEM well beyond the classroom setting. SSERC's STEM engagement portfolio offers individual educators and their institutions, young people and partners in industry to collaborate to create learning activities and opportunities in STEM for children, young people and adults in Scotland. At SSERC's Research Placement Celebration event, which took place at Glasgow University's Advanced Research Centre, Ms Adamson was presented with an Honorary Fellowship Award. SSERC's research placements enable students to deepen their understanding of STEM and STEM-related subjects, skills and research in conjunction with universities and companies including Babcock International and Ocean Winds. This news came as a wonderful surprise and a profound honour. I am deeply passionate about STEM learning, she said. At every turn, I want to encourage young people to get involved in science careers because these are not the careers of the future, they are the present. The rapid development in science and technology requires Scotland to keep pace. William, again, not to detract from Ms Adamson's achievements and what sounds like truly an excellent award, I personally, I kind of come from more of a humanities background, and I've heard a lot of people criticise STEM and say that there should be an A put in there to make it STEAM, so and including the arts, because the arts is also a major industry and raises a lot of money for public coffers. Would you agree, or would you just keep it as STEM?
Well, STEAM looks a bit old-fashioned, doesn't it? There's room for both of them. Obviously, there is. I'm from a humanities background myself, and I'm actually fairly hopeless in science, technology, engineering, and maths, he said, unraveling the acronym. but I think it's undeniable that the kind of things that are going to be going on in the world for the next century at least are going to require some expertise in all of these areas. And yes, you need the other side to things. You do need to have a cultural hinterland as well. But I think the application of these subjects and getting better at these subjects, and particularly for girls, which is important as well. I think that's something to be applauded. And I know Claire Adamson has been an advocate of uh, STEM in schools for quite some time, and has been very much involved with the Scottish Schools Education Research Centre. So it's a much deserved accolade, and I wouldn't go for STEAM just yet, Brian, but STEM will do for me for the moment.
Okay, fair enough. Here at Broadcasting Scotland, we were intrigued by a graphic on social media which showed all the new ferry routes between Ireland and the EU. It made us think what a comparison of routes from EU to Scotland might look like. Stavanger in Norway to Aberdeen is 500 kilometres. Esbjerg in Denmark to Dundee is 710 kilometres. In Denmark to Rosyth is 750 kilometres. Bremerhaven, Germany to Rosyth is 830 kilometres. Zeebrugge, Belgium to Rosyth, 715 kilometres. Dunkirk, France to Rosyth, 730 kilometres. Dunkirk, France to Rosslare in Ireland, 950 kilometres. Cherbourg, France to Dublin in Ireland is 815 kilometres, while Cherbourg to Carnryan in Scotland is 950 kilometres. Dublin in Ireland to Carnryan itself would be 230 kilometres. So why would Scotland be unable to support the same volume of trade as Ireland? Do you think, William, would we be able to have the same amount of trade routes to the EU as Ireland if we wanted, and why don't we have them already? Is it Brexit?
No, it's lack of investment, lack of investment in ferry services, lack of development of Scotland as a trader in its own right without having to go through England. We need people to come forward who are going to invest in these, and we probably also do need government support, at least initially. And I know that for the Scottish Government, the money isn't necessarily there to make new ferry routes, such as the ones you've described there, more viable, and particularly from Rosyth, but also, yes, from Dundee and Aberdeen. I don't think it's Brexit at all. It's just our constant tendency to undervalue and underinvest in ourselves, a habit that we absolutely have to break. Whatever happens with the Constitution, it's just a better way to be. I would much rather, of course, be doing it as an independent country, but we really need to value ourselves more. And that's what's behind the lack of this sort of thing for Scotland right now.
And there was talk recently, wasn't there, about a new a ferry from Rosyth to the EU, one which used to happen but
Yeah,
stopped. That
was it
seems
to
to have gone
Zeebrugge?
quiet.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's come up and then gone quiet from time to time. I think that is a possibility that that will happen, but the question is how much support it will need in order to be sustainable. But for goodness sake, looking at the amount of ferries we run internally, whatever folk may say about them, because it's a lot better than people say, we should certainly be able to have ferry routes to Europe. Absolutely, we should.
Well, thank you, William, for sticking with us despite the late start. You would have been gone by now if we'd started on time. Apologies to the viewers at home. But before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but we receive donations of around 2,500. We urgently need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear our debts as well. We're at crisis point here, and we really need to increase our donations to be able to survive and pay our bills. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, or please donate whatever you can afford. But thank you to you at home, and thank you to my guest, William, for your time and your patience with us again. And
Your patience with my rambling is equally valuable. Thank you very much.
No, not at all, not at all. And thank you to the viewers at home. Thank you for watching and good night.